Something I often hear from people is that blood bankers are very rigid and don't like to change what they're doing. But when you go back and actually look at what's happened over the last 30 years, there have been profound changes in what blood bankers do in their labs, in the donor centers, every day. And so, why was that happening? And the real answer is there's been two trends going on. On one hand, you have this changing demographics with growing populations and aging populations that are constantly putting more and more demands onto the testing and patient flow. And in parallel, you have all the efficiencies and responses that we've been making to try to compensate for that so that you can keep getting that work done with the people you have. And so for my section, I'm going to take a kind of a quick look back at what's been happening in the past and what were all the things that we've already done to create efficiencies and create growth and move forward. And then also going forward, take a look at saying, well, what do those demographic trends tell us about what the needs are going to be in the future, and where do we have to be ready to handle as we face this growing aging population? As I said, so future-facing growths. Now, so what I'm going to do is I have a model for workload, and what that model is it looks at the population that's over 65 years of age. We found that's a very good proxy for the workflow because that's who uses most of the blood and is getting most of the transfusion testing. And so as that population grows and shrinks, you have a good feel for what the patient load is, as all the incidence rates and epidemiology tie very closely to that demographic group. As well, for the sake of this study, I'm going to use US data. That is just because it's a pretty large market, so the data is stable. We have very good available census data the US tracks, and I actually found it's a pretty good midpoint for the global trend. So I'll show this a little bit later on. While your country may be a little higher, a little lower, it creates a very nice midpoint to kind of see globally where that trend is going. And to kind of build on where we were, I thought I'd take that automotive car analogy and go forward as a way to think about this. So you can almost picture your lab as a highway, or it's a road that you're trying to get your patient samples through, and those patients are the passengers in those cars. So if we go back 30 years, in the US, there were 26.5 million people over the age of 65, and we were doing a manual tube method, and those cars are cruising along at 80 kilometers per hour since we're in Toronto, and things are going well. And so you say, what's the first thing you want to do? Well, let's get the speed limit up. Let's go to column agglutination technology. That was introduced. You get less errors. It's a little bit easier to train and maintain, more consistency, and you're able to handle a little bit more of that patient volume. But within a few years later, that 26 million has grown to 29 million. And again, your labs are starting to get crunched. And that's right about when we really then build our new lane. And that was when the first type and screen automation technologies have come in place. So we've already moved from tube to column agglutination, now to automated technologies. And that has taken a huge burden off the amount of work coming through those labs, as people then get faster and can once again now handle those extra people with the same sort of testing. But that only lasts so long. You go a few years later, now it's 33 million, another 10 or 15% growth in that demographic. So what did we start to do? Mass transit introductions. That's where I say electronic cross-match. People have taken, in most countries, a strong push to say, I don't need to actually go and run a cross-match on every patient. If I invest in electronic cross-matching, now I've taken a huge chunk of tests out of what I have to do. That's given me a lot more efficiency, workload reduction, and now I can handle all those extra patients. And that kept us going for a little while. So what did we do next? Well, by 2010, here's where we were starting to get this real acceleration in growth of population. We've gone from 33 million to 41 million. It's almost about a 20% growth in those years. And we've had to respond. And so what have we seen? The biggest thing that hit then is blood utilization policy, so to speak. And that's where we've really, really seen a big dent in the amount of blood being used, which has impacted the donor center significantly. It also means less cross-matching and less work in the hospital. And that was the next big dent we took that helped bring things down. And we've also at the same time seen GPO tendering. And so we have in the US, it's Easy Pass. It's sort of a electronic billing. So it's, and if you use the electronic billing for your tolls, then you pay a little bit less. So it's kind of like the Easy Pass. With this GPO tendering, you're paying a little bit less for pricing, and you've got less blood flowing through. So, okay, you're handling things all right. You've got your all your cross-matching, your tendering. But even that has started to be a problem. So it's 2015. We've gone from 41 million now to 45 million. So a quick show of hands for all of you that are either donor or hospital-based. How many people are really comfortable, have all the staff they need, and have no problems running their labs now? Yep, I don't see a single hand up. So we've done all that, and if we had not implemented all those things, imagine the mess we'd be in if we were trying to use tubes and cross-match everyone and do all that work. So it's a problem. And because on top of that, what we've also seen is there's been new infectious disease testing requirements, and this has been really impacting the donor centers. As new emerging diseases, the need to continually test more and more globally is how you handle that. So the biggest trend that we've seen since then that's helped this has really been about network consolidations. So we have seen places, donor centers combining, we've seen hospitals centralizing data in their labs, and that's all about getting more and more efficiency and more testing volume out of the same people. The other big trend that we've seen that as a manufacturer we've focused a lot on is menu automation. So it's not enough just to run your type and screens. You have to run your antibody IDs, your phenotypes. The more that you can automate and move to your systems, the more you start to free up people. And it does, like a lot of these processes, take an investment to get things going, but once you invest that time, you've now freed it up and handle things. So that's where we are. The question is, where are we going to? So this right now is the by age, how many people in the US are at each age group as you go up. And so, as one would expect, the older we get, there's less people of that age group. But what's really scary is if you look out about 15 years, that whole curve with the baby boomers is shifting up. And you see that over 65 group has grown dramatically and very, very rapidly. And as we said, that's who's driving your patient load. What that actually looks like is within 15 years, it's a 55% increase in the number of patients, the number of people over 65 coming through your institutions. A few years out, it's almost a 100% increase by 2045. And you think about that, if you look over here, the number of people over 75 in 15 years are almost equal to the number of people over 65. So it's profound, and I don't think a lot of hospitals are really preparing themselves for this workload that's going to come. So, the big key that we're going to see, and we'll talk about this, is what you're doing now is getting you by barely today, but with this patient load coming, are you ready for that and starting to think about what's coming down the pike? And as I said, I alluded to before, it's not just a US trend. We're seeing in most of Western Europe, it's actually a higher percent of the population is going to be over 65. Japan, the same thing, a very high percent of the population over 65. But even in some of the less established, more more mature markets, South America, Latin America, Middle East, everywhere in the world, we are getting a growing, aging population, rapidly outpacing anything we've seen before. And so we've got to be ready to continually grow and proceed to handle this, or we're going to face a real crisis. The other interesting thing is the blood utilization technologies have done a fantastic job of reducing the workload coming through donor centers, and it's been declining. However, there's also a diminishing returns. We've hit the biggest efficiencies already, and many hospitals and countries have established a lot of those protocols. So every new incremental change in blood utilization is a diminishing return. And that population curve is going to break it. So while we've been seeing a decline, that's going to flatten and start rising up. And is it in 5 years? Is it 10 years? That's going to start going back up. And whereas now you've been fighting with this issue of trying to have decreasing demand, which means you're having less people, less staff, you're now going to reach that status quo and then have to deal with a ramp of blood coming through again. The other challenge we have is on the blood donation side. This group here that's over the age of 42 to 60, that's where all of our donations are coming from for the most part around the world. That's the cohort that does it. New donors are very few in between anymore. But the problem is, as this cohort's been aging, this outer edge of the curve hasn't changed. As they get older, less and less people are able to donate due to conditions and other issues. So this number of blood donors is getting older and decreasing. Right at a point in time, once this group moves here and needs the blood, who's coming behind to fill that funnel of donors, which means more cost and more effort to donate to become efficient on that side. And as I said before, so we have 45 million now. How about 71 million people over the age of 65 in 15 years in the US? Global trends are there. And I don't think there's any shortage in blood safety requirements changing. We're going to be required to do more testing, more regulatory hurdles, more documentation, more work on top of that. We also have another issue that I think people have spoken about. We've done some surveys, and half of the lab directors named staffing issues as the #1 challenge they're facing. I don't think it's any surprise that we are seeing dramatic changes. We see retirements where, by recent survey, I think 40% of the current staffers are expected to retire in the next 10 years. We've seen vacancy rates approaching 11%, turnover rates over 20%. And I don't think anyone is surprised by these numbers. You're all living and dealing with this. And so if we think back to our highway, it's kind of like now we have a road closed for lane employment. So you got people, you have this jammed mess of all this work, you're already jammed, and now you've got a lane closed for training. You're constantly cycling people. I had a lab I visited that had 4 people working in the lab, except 2 people were working, and those 2 people were being shadowed by 2 other people that were training. And one of those people was being set to retire on top of it. So they're paying twice the staff load for those tests at all times. It's not sustainable. And so we really have just 4 options. We can increase budgets, which I know nobody wants to do. We can lower safety standards. I mean, you could stop doing extra checks. You could stop confirming samples, but I don't think people really want to do that either. You could reduce services. One outcome of this might be your turnaround times are going to suffer. Maybe you'll say, I can't get you samples back in an hour. You're going to get them back in 3 hours. It's the best you're going to do. Or you have to increase your efficiencies. We've got to start doing things to be faster, more effective. So my goal here is to say, hopefully we got 2 great people coming up that are going to talk about what they've done in the hospital, what they've done in donor centers to already start doing this, to give you some ideas of things to think about. But my hope to you is start thinking now about what you're going to be doing to be ready in 10 years, because if you wait till then, it's too late to respond. You're going to be in trouble. It's continuous improvement every day. Start improving what you're doing to become faster, more lean, more efficient. Look to the manufacturers like us to help give you solutions technically that'll help, but also look to what you're doing every day to be more efficient.